Hello and welcome to this short video, Novel Foods. My name's Andy Bowles and I'm a food lawyer. Now this is the 36th in a series of 100 short videos that I'm recording on the topic of UK food law. Now you may be watching this video as part of our online training service, in which case you can download some additional materials and have access to an hour-long webinar, obviously going into a lot more depth on this topic. You can also download the slides that you can see behind me. But if you're watching me on the YouTube channel, then you're of course very welcome. So what is a novel food? Well, a novel food is a new food. That's what we're talking about here. So it's a newly introduced food, and food is in the broadest term. I'll come on to that in a moment. So basically the legal definition for a novel food in its simplest term, it's a little bit more complex than this, but in its simplest term, is any food not used for human consumption to any significant degree within the UK or EU before the 15th of May 1997. Now that's an old date, isn't it? What does that refer to? Well, that was the day the European Union first introduced novel food legislation. So the idea was this: any food where there was no history of regular, substantial consumption prior to the date the legislation was introduced in 1997 was identified as a novel food. Clearly, anything that's introduced onto the market after that date, where there is no history of it having been consumed previously, would fall within this category. So what am I talking about, novel foods? I said it was a rather broad definition because it's not just foods, it could be new foods. For example, you could have things like phytostanols used in cholesterol reducing spreads. A new food that's been deliberately placed on the market for a particular purpose, but there's no history of any consumption of that in the past. That's a novel food. Or it could be a traditional food, and this is quite a common area for novel foods. It could be a food that's been eaten, or there is a history of consumption or elsewhere around the world, in some South American seed or something like that, but no history of consumption within the UK or EU prior to 1997. That is a novel food. Things like recent ones that have been approved, chia seeds, for example. You've got things like baobab that you'll find in food supplements and things of that nature. But it's not just foods, it also applies to novel processes. So it could be foods themselves that have been produced using new techniques. And the example here is milk treated with ultraviolet light to increase the levels of vitamin D present. That would fall within the scope of novel foods. So what? Something is a novel food. What happens next? Well, if something is identified as a novel food, so we know that there's no history of previous consumption, then it cannot be placed on the market in the UK until it's been authorised, because it's recognised as being a regulated product. So this is quite a common area I've personally come across over the years, particularly in the area of food supplements. If you're not sure about food supplements, guess what? There's another video on the topic. But it's not unusual to come across ingredients of food supplements where there has been no obvious history of consumption prior to the 15th of May 1997. So the answer is, if you're a manufacturer or importer of something like that, a food supplement, and one of your ingredients is novel, then your product cannot be placed on the market until it is authorised. There are two different ways you can get authorisation. You can get full authorisation if we're talking about a new food. But if it is one of these traditional foods from somewhere else, you're using a root vegetable from, Southeast Asia or something that we've not come across here before, but there is evidence of human consumption elsewhere, then you can go down the traditional food notification route. So the application is made to the Food Standards Agency in England and Wales and Northern Ireland, Food Standards Scotland in Scotland, but it's using the regulated products portal on the Food Standards Agency website that will actually deal with this. So what happens? You make an application for authorization to place a novel food on the market. Well, you'll need to provide a substantial dossier of evidence demonstrating that the novel food does not pose a safety risk. Of course, if this is a new food and we've not come across it before, that safety dossier must be absolutely comprehensive. The sorts of things they look at, it's not just whether the food will cause a problem when consumed, and for it to interact, for example, with the human body. But with novel foods, the assessors, the Food Standards Agency, would look at, for example, interactions with others. I mean, a good example of this is recent applications for CBD products, the products derived from the cannabis plant. There's a separate video on that if you want to go and have a look at that. But CBD is a novel food, and one of the issues that the Food Standards Agency has been considering as part of its assessment is how a component within the CBD might interact with enzymes which might interact or disrupt metabolism of drugs normally used in the treatment for certain illnesses. In other words, it's quite complicated, isn't it? So anyway, the scientific assessment needs to be done, submitted to the Food Standards Agency. What they'll do is they'll do an initial validation. They'll just look at the application, see on the face of it whether everything's been completed, all the bits that they're asking for have been supplied. But they won't actually assess it immediately. Once it's been validated, for example, in the case of CBD, the Food Standards Agency chose to allow products that had submitted a valid application to place the products on the market. Because there were already so many products out there, CBD products, the Food Standards Agency thought that it would be appropriate just to let the trade continue whilst they assessed the individual applications. But as long as a valid application was made by a certain date, then that was okay. But typically in a novel food, authorization will be required. So once the application's in, it's been validated by the Food Standards Agency, they'll provide an opinion. What they'll do is they'll assess the safety of the novel food, and they'll determine whether, if it's going to be accepted, whether there are any conditions of use. The conditions of use typically would be, for example, limitations on which foods the novel food could be used as an ingredient, and things like labelling of the novel food. Once they've looked at all that, if they go through the whole process and they're happy, then within 7 months of the risk assessment being performed, then what the Food Standards Agency will do is they'll publish this typically in regulations. And what the regulations will do, it'll identify the novel food, it'll identify, for example, if appropriate, the foodstuffs it can be used as an ingredient or the circumstances in which it can be used. It'll identify any additional labelling that might be necessary in terms of use, and indeed might include information on the levels of the novel food that can be consumed by, for example, a healthy adult over a given day or whatever. So there's a whole bunch of conditions that they might put in place. Of course, they might decide to put no conditions in place or put a whole range of conditions. It's up to the Food Standards Agency. It's only once the regulations are published that the novel food has been authorised that it can then be placed on the market in the circumstances set out within and the restrictions set out in the regulations. So the other route is, of course, through traditional foods. So novel foods they need to be derived from primary production. So in other words, farming, fishing, that sort of thing, with a history of safe food used in a third country over a continued period of at least 25 years in the customary diet of a significant number of people. So if you want to place on the market a food that you've imported from, say, South America, you'd have to demonstrate that that was the case. It had been consumed for at least 25 years by a significant number of people, and what effectively the Food Standards Agency will be looking at here in their authorisation procedure is they'll be looking for any reasoned safety objections. They basically put it out on consultation, say, look, we've got this product. People have been eating it in South America for 25 years. People seem to have been eating it in significant quantities. Has anyone got any comments on that? And if there are no significant comments brought back from the wider community, then the food will be added to the register of authorised novel foods. So, to get a novel food authorization, you need to go to the Food Standards Agency website and apply for a regulated product. So the regulated products application process is therefore, it covers a whole range of things from novel foods to food additives and all sorts of things. But once you start the process, it will guide you through. There are guidance notes on the content of the dossiers that's required for a novel food. Once it's gone through the process, then we have a register of novel food authorizations. Now, it may be that you're an importer of food or you're a manufacturer, you're looking at a food now and you're thinking, well, how do I know it's actually novel or not? Well, the answer is, in law, it's your responsibility. So if you think, oh, it'll be all right, well, no, it won't be. If you suspect it could be novel, then it's down to you to check. One way you can check is by using the Novel Food Authorizations Register. So go onto there. If it's a plant or something, be ready to find out its Latin name before you go onto this register, because sometimes customary names of foods are not always well known by everybody. So, when you're searching for it, make sure you use every sort of connotation. If you're still unsure whether your food is novel or not, then you should contact the novel food team at the Food Standards Agency. You're required by law to do so. So you don't just put it out there on the market, you make reasonable inquiry first and then contact the Food Standards Agency if after reasonable inquiry you still are unsure as the status of your ingredient, it might be novel food. If they come back and say, yes, it's novel food, you'll need authorization and they'll guide you through that process. If it's not a novel food, well then you don't need authorization. There we are. That's just a brief word on novel foods. That's just one of 99 other videos on the topic of UK food law. Hopefully you'll join me on another one. Thank you for watching.